wherever it wants to in Syria. The notion that Syria is a sovereign state is ridiculous at this juncture. Your Israelis say that the number one threat to Israel isn't Iran, it's Turkey, and that simply can't be allowed. Israel is a hostile entity to the United States, and we need to recognize that. We also need to recognize that whatever we're doing with Israel, the crimes that Israel are committing because of us, basically the United States sought to use the forces of Islamic extremism inside Syria to weaken Bashar al-Assad, and now on Damascus and in his hold on the Syrian countryside. All the while, Turkey is seeking to figure out what to do with this Jolani victory. I mean, everybody needs to remember that Jolani wasn't Turkey's go-to man, and Israel and the United States are looking to create a WMD type excuse for regime change in the form of a nuclear weapons program, a limited vision of Islam. I can't see this relationship lasting.
Israel's bombed more than just Damascus. Israel continues to strike wherever it wants to in Syria. The notion that Syria is a sovereign state is ridiculous at this juncture. I mean, and the other, I think, vote that needs to be considered is, what does Turkey think of this? Turkey has a vested interest in the future of Syria, and the Israelis are obviously concerned about this. This is why I think we're looking at a demilitarized zone to create a gap between the Israeli-occupied spaces of southern Syria and the limits of Turkey's military progress into Syria. The Israelis fear having Turkey directly on their border because that creates an opportunity for force-on-force confrontation that could lead to a direct war between Israel and Turkey, which is something Israel doesn't want. You had senior Israelis say that the number one threat to Israel isn't Iran, it's Turkey. And so I think that's why the United States is pushing so hard to get this demilitarized space. Well, it's really interesting to see what has developed inside of Syria. We have a former ISIS commander, Ahmed Sheh, or formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Gulani, have his image and his reputation and his history as an ISIS commander completely whitewashed and now being welcomed with open arms by the West. Where do you think Syria is going with this new leadership? Like you, I'm somewhat perplexed as to what exactly is going on here. Either the United States and other nations have basically erased their collective memories about what ISIS was, what ISIS is, or Golani was in the game the entire time. And there, of course, is some hints with U.S. intelligence about, giving ISIS space in order to destabilize the Assad regime. That basically the United States sought to use the forces of Islamic extremism inside Syria to weaken Bashar al-Assad. And now, Assad has fallen and they have to live with the consequences. But I don't know where this is going, because Golani is inherently incompatible with any vision the United States has of normalized society. This is a man, you could put a suit on this guy, you could put a tie on this guy, but he still commands people who are committing horrific atrocities against Shia, against Alawites, against Christians, and against any Sunni who doesn't agree with their limited vision of Islam. I can't see this relationship lasting. I think what we're seeing is evidence that Golani's victory took everybody by surprise. And people are still trying to come to grips with how they're ultimately going to, to react to this. And I think, for those who have watched, al-Jolani take over this leadership position inside of Syria, we watched him close up all of the resistance camps inside of Syria, saying that, we can't get involved with the resistance against Israel. There have been a lot of rumors about normalization with the state of Israel. And of course, as Israel bombs Syria and takes some of its land, and destroys the equipment of the Syrian military, al-Jilani doesn't seem to have any big responses. What do you say about that? I think this is proof positive that Golani's victory even took Golani by surprise. There doesn't seem to have been any long-term planning, any contingencies in place. We're seeing a man seeking to consolidate his hold on Damascus and in his hold on the Syrian countryside. All the while, Turkey is seeking to figure out what to do with this Golani victory. I mean, everybody needs to remember that Golani wasn't Turkey's go-to man in Damascus. Turkey actually had a Syrian government in exile that it was looking to install. And Golani got in ahead of that game. Nobody expected this outcome. And as a result, you're seeing just people making things up as they go along. No plan whatsoever on how to proceed. And even the United States. I mean, the imagery of, the American admiral who commands Central Command, whose forces today are in Syria and Iraq, allegedly hunting down ISIS, standing side by side with Giuliani, shaking his hand, just is mind-boggling to me. Steve Bannon recently said his impeccable sources confirmed that the U.S. and Israel are still pushing for regime change in Iran, while the Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal has claimed that billionaire Bill Amann was pressuring Charlie Kirk to back such a project, reportedly offering him $150 million. None of this is in the mainstream, but it echoes the writing on the wall that we've seen before over regime change operations. Given your experience exposing false WMD claims in Iraq and warning about how propaganda and financial pressure are used to manufacture consent for war, do you see credible signs that Washington and Tel Aviv again are laying the groundwork for regime change in Iran now under the Trump administration? Well, I think we need to understand that the United States and Israel have had, for some time now, policies of regime change. Even when the Obama administration was negotiating the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of the Iran nuclear deal, their CIA was creating an Iran mission center whose job was to find the mechanisms necessary to remove the Iranian regime from power. It's been the goal and objective of every American presidency since the Reagan administration. No American president ever has thought, oh, I can live in peace and harmony with the theocracy in Thrawn. And I think the Iranians are fully aware of this. I mean, they make tactical decisions about the necessity to negotiate here, negotiate there, because they're fending off a variety of threats, sanctions, economic threats, covert threats, etc. And yes, I think Israel and the United States are looking to create a WMD type excuse for regime change in the form of a nuclear weapons program. This is where I think the wisdom of the Iranians comes into play. There's many people out there saying that the 12-day war, Israel's surprise attack against Iran, is proof positive that Iran must seek a nuclear weapon. I've said from day one that if Iran does seek a nuclear weapon, that will be the end of the Iranian regime, because all gloves will come off. And I think the Iranian government understands this, because we're seeing them enter a new relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency, even as everybody acknowledges the IAEA played a role in facilitating the Israeli attack. But the Iranians understand that in order to keep Russia and China on their side, they must stay in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And to stay in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they must have a relationship with the IAEA. And so long as Iran takes his tact, it's going to be very difficult for Israel and the United States to manufacture an excuse for a regime change operation, especially with Iran in possession of missiles that can inflict extraordinarily harm on Israel and any future endeavor of that nature. Well, United States has been a top Israeli espionage target from the very beginning. We only need to bring up the name of Jonathan Poller to understand that Israel has been spying on the United States since the 1980s, and I would say even prior to that. Israel is very concerned about the United States, and especially about American leadership. They need to understand what is being said behind closed doors. They need to ensure that America continues to support Israel without any hesitation. So what they're looking for by monitoring the communications of the president and his inner circle is an indication of a weakening of resolve, and then Israel will turn on its influence system here in the United States to firm up that resolve using whatever tactics and techniques the Israelis use, money, blackmail, you name it. This is what they do. I'll just say this up front. Israel is not a friend of the United States. I wish people would understand this wholeheartedly. They're not our friends. They're not our allies. They use us for their survival. The Zionist entity in Israel cannot survive without the full support of the United States. And so it's the top national security priority of Israel to ensure that America continues to support Israel. And this is why you see them spying on our president. I'll say that one more time for the American audience. Spying on our president, your president, and that simply can't be allowed. Israel is a hostile entity to the United States, and we need to recognize that. We also need to recognize that whatever we're doing with Israel, the crimes that Israel are committing because of us, it impacts our reputation as well. The world is recognizing Israel as a genocidal entity. And the United States is being hit with that label too, because without us, there would be no Israeli genocide in Gaza today. I think they've been trying to manipulate the Trump administration. And again, it's very difficult to get into the mind of Donald Trump. Here I go. I think he put himself in a trap. You know, the funny thing is, if you listen to Donald Trump long enough, you realize on some occasions he actually says the truth. I think the truth was that he thought it was going to be a hell of a lot easier to end this war than it turned out to be. And now he's just out of options. He's out of plans, and he's very frustrated. He recognizes that Russia's just not going to yield or be malleable, you know. He's not going to come in and form Russia. Russia has its point of view, and they're going to stick with it. So you can either tuck your tail in between your legs and run, which is a sign of weakness, or you can achieve the same result by appearing to be strong. You put forward conditions that can never be achieved. And then when they fail to be achieved, you say, well, if you're not serious, then we're out of here. You know, the conditions are we're going to do this, that, and we're going to go 100% here, 50% there. We're taking it down. We're collapsing the Russian economy. But you got to do what we're doing, knowing full well that Europe can't do that. So you create the conditions for failure. But then when you pull the plug, as I believe the United States is going to do, you blame Europe and you cast the blame on Europe. And I think that's where we're at right now. I think Trump recognizes that there's no further he can go with Russia. And when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, there's a lot he wants to do with Russia that has nothing to do with Ukraine, but he can't get there until Ukraine is resolved. And so he's created this contradictory stance. I want to be friends with Russia, but first I'm going to collapse their economy, kind of thing. Knowing that there's no chance of these statements becoming reality and therefore giving him the out that he's actually looking for, which is to disentangle themselves from this conflict, knowing Europe's incapable of standing on its own 2 feet by themselves. That if the United States fully disengages, Europe has no choice. And that's why you see all these games being played right now in Poland. These are the acts of desperate people trying to keep the United States locked in to try and shape events, shape a narrative that, will be sufficient to enrage this president so that he, continues to be engaged, as opposed to the disengagement path that he appears to be on right now. Again, I'm always loaded to speak on behalf of Russia because I'm not Russian. But what I would say is this, that the Russians understand the political reality that exists in the United States, and they understand the limits of what Trump can say and can do, and they understand that a lot of what he's doing is an act of theater, and so they just ignore 90% of what he says, and that's what's going on right now. The Russians, I can't speak for them, but I don't imagine the Russians at this point in time are panicking. I think they understand that Trump's in a very, very difficult situation, that he has to say what he needs to say to get out of this situation. And the Russians will let actions speak louder than words. Trump can talk about doing this, that, and the other thing, but as long as he's not doing this, that, and the other thing, then it's as if he didn't say anything. So I think that's the way the Russians are treating this. I think they've taken a master class in how to, in Trump policy, Trump logic, Trumpology, but no, I don't see the Russians overreacting, over-responding to anything that comes out of the United States right now. We've learned from the news that Britain has officially taken command of Ukrainian troops. Do you think that is the case, or they're just making things up and that's not happening in Ukraine? Because if that would be the case, it's a huge escalation on the part of Ukrainians to let Brits coming in and capturing everything. Well, I mean, the Brits are already, directing this fight through Ramstein and elsewhere. So I don't understand what it is people are saying is happening that hasn't already been happening. I don't think at the battalion level that the battalion commanders are British. I think they're Ukrainian. I think the brigade commanders are Ukrainian. I think the corps commanders are Ukrainian. I think the commander of the Ukrainian army is Ukrainian. I think there's British advisors that are attached to these different levels, and they provide advice, and and they're influential. But I don't believe that Ukraine has turned over, the tactical and operational responsibilities to the British. I think the British are there as strategic advisors, big picture advisors, but not as it's a proxy army. We know this. We know it's a proxy army. So I don't know what everybody's surprised about when it turns out that the Ukrainian army is responding to the directives, the strategic vision of the British. It's the British, after all, since 2023 that have taken the lead in advising the Ukrainian army. They're the ones who run the program, keep Ukraine in the fight. So yeah, there should be British officers there if that's the case. But the idea that, suddenly everybody's going to have a Sandhurst, accent and, and salute smartly like the Queen's Grenadiers. No, no. Yeah. I mean, structurally, of course, it's very complicated. First of all, Ukraine was military that, consisted primarily of legacy Soviet equipment, modernized and upgraded Now, what we've seen is that the West has been bringing in sort of a hodgepodge of Western gear, whether it be American Monet tanks, British, Challengers, the Leopards of Germany, AMX tanks coming out of France. Logistically, that's a nightmare to have that. Training-wise, it's problematic, but that's the reality of this multinational approach to sustaining this Ukrainian in conflict from a command and control standpoint. The British have taken charge of the fight now. They run Ramstein, and I believe they are the senior advisors when the Ukrainian army draws up its war plans. We saw that in Kursk. When the Ukrainian military went into Kursk, the Russians that were opposing them were saying, we're dealing with a whole different enemy here. We're dealing with an enemy that's has full satellite integration, real-time intelligence, AI-generated decision points coming in, new weapons, new tactics, new everything. Then the Russians proceeded to kill everybody. But that's a NATO-driven, British-dominated system, and I think you're seeing that play out through the rest of Ukraine. That's just the reality when you have had your army rebuilt 6 times. I believe it is now the Ukrainian army has been rebuilt 6 times in this conflict. And each time it gives up, more and more of, its sovereignty and becomes more and more a proxy army. I mean, remember, it was there Evangeline that bragged. It said the Ukrainian army is the first European army. What did she mean by that? And then we have to use it wisely. Again, sometimes you just have to wait, and people that don't normally tell the truth end up telling the truth. And I think Ursula von der Leyen was telling the truth. Ukraine is Europe's first army, European army. Doesn't mean they're going to win, doesn't mean it's good. It just means that it's not a Ukrainian army. And at least now we have the head of the EU, the European Commission, acknowledging that when Donald Trump says that we can collapse the Russian economy if Europe decides to get along with our plan about putting tariffs on Russia and Europe not receiving Russian oil, I would assume the final goal is the Russian military. Do you think they're going to get there if they could achieve it? Let's assume that the Trump administration could achieve the main objective which would be stopping Europeans from receiving Russia. How is that going to influence the Russian army? I don't think that's going to have an impact on the Russian army. I mean, there may be some fuel shortages brought about by these Ukrainian drone attacks against the variety of refining capacity in Russia, but the Russian army is fully funded, fully equipped, fully supported. The danger comes in the Russian civilian sector economy there. Reports are that because of the war, there's job shortages. This is why the Russians were looking to provide, special visa arrangements for foreigners to come in and help you fill the manpower shortage. I had a fascinating conversation last week with a director of international finance of MGIMO, which is the big foreign policy university. That's where all the diplomats get trained. So this guy's a serious guy. One of the things that Trump and his advisors need to understand is that right now Russia's still playing the, we're a capitalist country game. So their economy still is organized and functions on classic capitalism type model. But what Russia is fully capable of doing is going into what would be called a mobilization economy. That is to decouple from concepts of capitalism and go into a pure Stalinist type mode that was last embraced in the 1930s when Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union. in the face, by the way, of massive international sanctions and efforts to isolate the Soviet Union. And the way that Stalin overcame that was through, this mobilization economy. Russia could very easily, if it was a matter of existential survival, slip into mobilization economy. The United States never could, but Russia can. And this is the fatal mistake of the thinking of Scott Biss, because to get Russia to that state, the United States would have to be so disruptive of the world order that, sometimes you got to be careful what you ask for. Not only would Russia's economy not collapse and is never going to collapse, it would transition into something that has totally delineate from Western sources of influence. But the blowback to the United States could lead to the collapse of the American economy. I'll say it one more time. The Russian economy will never collapse because ultimately the Russians have the ability to transition into a Stalin-like mobilization economy. The American economy can't transition into that, and we will suffer blowback from trying to go after the Russians because in order to succeed, we're going to have to alienate relations with India, China. We're going to create massive disruptions. And the blowback to us could be fatal economically. So no, I don't think the Russian economy is in danger of collapsing anytime soon, if ever. I do believe that pressure can be exerted on the American economy that can be detrimental for our collective economic health. Again, I have to point out to people that my name is not Michael Hudson and I'm not an economist. So, I defer to smarter people than me on this one, but I will say this about the Russian economy. It has the capacity of going full stalling on the world. And what I mean by that is you ain't never going to collapse it. Russia has all of you self-sufficient in terms of resources. So it's one of the few nations that can actually build a wall around itself and continue to function. By the way, I think with India and China, with the case of these two countries so important for the Russian economy, they're getting closer to Russia. I don't know if you heard that the participation of Indian military personnel in the Belarus-Russian exercises, they call it West 2025, and many people in the NATO countries are concerned about what's going on between India and Russia because they see Russia as a somehow mediator to improve the relationship between India and China as well. That's the big look. The West has put so much emphasis on the potential of using India as a spoiler for BRICS. I mean, is it Lutnick, the trade advisor, just outright said, we're going to take the eye out of BRICS. We're going to take the eye out of it. We're going to collapse and it's going to go down. And that's the fantasy that exists. The concept of exploiting, the friction that exists between India and China to break BRICS apart. But I think right now what you're seeing is India just saying pound sand, and Russia is serving as an effective mediator between India and China. Now we have a situation where, Russia's, if we're trying to collapse the Russian economy by going after Russian oil sales, we failed because the Indians are what? 42% of their oil purchases now come from Russia. China, Siberian 2 pipeline, under construction now, locked. And I think Russia, that ship's done sailed. India and China have already decided where they're going, and it'll be the United States that ends up being isolated here. And this is why I think you're seeing Trump, because this isn't just about cutting the strings with Ukraine. This is about solving a whole host of other issues, because we've been trying to resolve the Ukraine conflict in our favor by, leveraging whatever influence we thought we had on India, on China, etc., and it's backfired. And so now, not only have we failed to achieve an outcome that would be desirable from our position with Ukraine, but we've also weakened ourselves via, India and China from a geopolitical standpoint. And this is why I think the president might